Hello, and welcome to a Reader's History of Science Fiction. I'm Alex Howe, and this is Episode 15, Robert Heinlein Part 2, Politics, Religion, and Sex. Okay, I'm being kind of sensationalist with that title, but in all seriousness, the most famous of Heinlein's adult novels are Starship Troopers, which is all about civic duty, Stranger in a Strange Land, which is a very subversive take on religion, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, which is steeped in Heinlein's radical libertarian politics, and Time Enough for Love, which I cannot emphasize enough how much a product of the sexual revolution that one is. I've never liked the term adult novels because of the obvious double entendre, but in this case it's rather apt. Many of these stories are not for kids. Some of them are probably alright for teenagers, and Starship Troopers was technically written for kids, but they're generally things where you probably want to use parental judgment. These books were mostly written in the 60s and 70s, which is technically Heinlein's middle period, but is already past what we've been calling the golden age of the 50s. And Heinlein seems to have embraced the new trends of the time. This is a taste of the new wave, the movement of softer sci-fi that focused more on cultural issues, which we'll get to in full detail in a few episodes. And where Isaac Asimov railed against the new wave for its lack of scientific rigor, Heinlein dove right in. Or perhaps you might say he kept doing what he had always been doing, writing his quote-unquote social science fiction while weaving in the scientific rigor he'd learned as an engineer. Before we get to his most famous novels, though, I actually want to start with Heinlein's short stories, because those came first, before and during his juvenile period. In fact, he only published 2 short stories after his last juvenile novel, All You Zombies and Searchlight. After that, he devoted himself entirely to novels and nonfiction. But while he wasn't as prolific as Asimov in this area, several of his short stories have also been very influential. One of Heinlein's earliest stories, If This Goes On, is a novella that many people consider very prescient today, depending on your political persuasion. It's a dystopian story about a future America ruled by a Christian fundamentalist dictatorship, which controls the populace by psychological manipulation through mass media. You can make of that what you will. Personally, I get more of an eerie vibe from The Year of the Jackpot. This is the story of a statistician who notices that human behavior moves in cycles, and when multiple cycles peak or bottom out at the same time, extreme events happen, like the stock market crash of 1929. But now, he says, every cycle he tracks, from economics to religion to fashion, are soon going to coincide, and disasters of apocalyptic proportions ensue. If that's not a metaphor for 2020, I don't know what is. Another famous story is The Man Who Sold the Moon. This is a rare case of Heinlein not being imaginative enough. Written in 1950, it describes the first moon landing in 1978. However, it mostly concerns a corrupt businessman who lies, cheats, and steals to obtain the property rights to the moon that most people consider worthless. Several of Heinlein's stories describe exotic environments in time and space. And He Built a Crooked House tells the tale of a man who built a house in the shape of a 3D cross, only for it to collapse into a 4D hypercube during an earthquake, with all the doors and windows leading into each other, or else to random places around the world. As an aside, And He Built a Crooked House may have one of the weirdest titles I've ever seen because of its punctuation. The proper punctuation is double open quote, single open quote, M dash, And He Built a Crooked House, M dash, single close quote, double close quote. If you're in Britain, swap the single and double quotes. The outer set of quotes are because it's a short story. That's just standard style guide stuff. The inner set of quotes are there because the title is a quote, or technically a misquote, from a nursery rhyme, and the M dashes are there because it's a sentence fragment. Meanwhile, By His Bootstraps and All You Zombies both concern time travel and postulate mind-bending time paradoxes where events cause themselves to happen. By His Bootstraps actually gave its name to this type of situation, now called the Bootstrap Paradox. As Doctor Who says, Google it. Also, All You Zombies has that same weird punctuation, this time with a quote from the story's dialogue. And of course, I can't ignore The Green Hills of Earth. I wasn't familiar with this story like I was the others. Framed as a non-fiction magazine article, it tells the tale of a brilliant poet and songwriter who wishes to return to Earth before he dies, and composes the beloved song The Green Hills of Earth on his final voyage. This song, in fact, already existed in the real-life stories of Moore and Kuttner, Chamblot, and Quest of the Starstone, where they wrote out 3 verses. But Heinlein writes a further 6 verses and fragments of 2 more. You can even find people singing it on YouTube, although it's not to be confused with The Blue-Green Hills of Earth, which is a religious hymn. But the important thing about The Green Hills of Earth was not so much the story, but where it was published. As I described in the last episode, this was one of the key events that pushed sci-fi into traditional publishing. Even 20 years later, Isaac Asimov wrote about it, quote, "I'll never forget the shock that rumbled through the entire world of science fiction fandom when Heinlein broke the Slicks barrier by having an undiluted science fiction story of his published in the Saturday Evening Post." Unquote. Slicks in this context meant the glossy magazines as opposed to the cheaper pulps. But of course, Heinlein's greatest influence came through his novels. Let's start with Starship Troopers. This was really a transitional book for Heinlein, one of his juvenile novels, but with heavier material, leading it to be rejected by his usual publisher and published as an adult novel instead. And indeed, the style seems transitional between the teenage adventure story of Have Spacesuit Will Travel and his more serious political and philosophical stories like The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. Shortly after it was published, Floyd Gale wrote a review saying that the book was, quote, "well told, crammed with political theory, and of exceptional interest to veterans with battle experience, but youngsters will find it melancholy and verbose," unquote. And he then goes on to give it 3 separate ratings. For children, 2.5 stars out of 5. For adults, 4.5 stars out of 5. And the rating for civilians, question mark. And that's the general sentiment with which it was received. Most people thought it was well crafted, but politically controversial and over the heads of kids. Starship Troopers is about Johnny Rico, a young soldier who joins the military in the Mobile Infantry, better known as the Space Marines, during a protracted war against spider-like aliens called the Bugs. The story follows Rico through basic training, some disastrous early battles, continuing to officer school, and finally scoring a major victory that will turn the tide of the war. It sounds simple, but there's a lot of material in there. First off, and the part that is perhaps most beloved by fans, Heinlein does an exceptional job of describing how a futuristic soldier lives and fights, kitted out with power armor, jetpacks, and futuristic weapons, drawing on both his scientific knowledge and his time in the Navy for guidance. As military science fiction, it is top-notch, and I contend it set the standard for the genre afterwards. From Joe Haldeman's Forever War to Warhammer 40K to John Scalzi's Old Man's War, even stories that have very different political views to Heinlein's clearly draw on Starship Troopers for inspiration. James Cameron even told the actors in Aliens to read the book to understand their parts better. Heinlein's politics in the book, however, are more checkered. Robert Heinlein described himself as a lifelong radical libertarian, something that is pretty obvious from his later work, but Starship Troopers takes it in a different direction. It's more about civic duty and the role of the military in his ideal radical libertarian society, and many critics have described it as overly militaristic or even fascist. In fact, Joe Haldeman wrote his classic The Forever War, partly in response to Starship Troopers for that very reason. But I disagree with that assessment. Rather than being militaristic, I think Heinlein presents a realist take on war. It's jingoistic, to be sure, which I attribute partly to having a biased narrator, but it doesn't feel propagandistic. The society behind that jingoism is portrayed unironically as being free and equitable, and the cause of the war as being just. Remember, this was before Vietnam and less than 15 years after World War II, so that would have been fairly easily accepted by many readers at the time. In fact, one of the most fascist-sounding elements of the book, that only military veterans have the right to vote, is really almost the opposite. For one, it wasn't just veterans, it was everyone who had done government work or public service. But more importantly, Heinlein goes to great lengths in the story to explain the justification for it. The government wants to ensure in the strongest terms that everyone who votes has the best interests of society as a whole at heart. And the surest way to do that is to only allow the vote to people who have already proved they have society's best interests at heart, those who have served. It sounds weird by our standards, but that was one of Heinlein's strengths, making you question your assumptions. Not everyone agrees with that point of view, of course. You may be aware that there's a movie of Starship Troopers, but be warned, it's nothing like the book. In fact, at best, it's a parody of the book by someone who didn't understand the message. Someone who saw the fascist version of that message instead. Not to mention the fact that there's no power armor or other serious military sci-fi elements. Actually, the movie was weirdly prescient in some ways. You see, if you were to watch the movie without knowing its background, you would think it was a scathing critique of the George W. Bush administration and the post-9/11 security apparatus made circa 2005. It shows a lot of the same attitudes that George Lucas voiced when he made Revenge of the Sith that same year. The thing is, Starship Troopers wasn't made in 2005. It was made in 1997. And I'm a little young to remember that time that well, but it just feels out of place to put that kind of movie in the late 90s. I'll refrain from digging deeper into real-world politics, especially a week before the 2020 election. Instead, let's talk about religion. Ha! Okay, but seriously, the next book on the list is Stranger in a Strange Land. And if Starship Troopers went to some weird places regarding politics, Stranger in a Strange Land got even weirder about religion. It's hard to know where to start with this one. Heinlein started working on it as early as 1948, but as it developed, it collected a lot of the cultural development of the 50s and early 60s, and by the time it was published in 1961, it had turned into something that seems like it would have been all but unimaginable in the 40s. In fact, when it was published, Heinlein had to cut out a lot of the most controversial chunks, along with editing for length. His original vision for the book was finally published in 1991, 3 years after his death. I didn't realize it at the time, but the one I read was actually the original abridged version, which still got pretty crazy. Stranger in a Strange Land is about Valentine Michael Smith, Mike for short, a baby who was born on a doomed expedition to Mars and was subsequently raised by Martians. 25 years later, he is found and brought back to Earth, but he struggles to adapt to Earth culture because the Martians are so different, and in his view better, of course. Among their oddities, Martians are hatched from eggs. They eat their dead in religious rituals, and their leaders, the Old Ones, are actually dead elders who linger after death as spirits. Martians alive and dead have superhuman intelligence and psychic powers, which Mike shares, and the Old Ones can debate for centuries on seemingly trivial matters. To share a glass of water with a Martian makes them a quote-unquote water brother, a deeply personal relationship such as we might call blood brothers, because water is so rare on Mars. And, which becomes important later, the closest thing they have to religion is summed up in the word grok. According to Mike, grok literally means to drink. Figuratively, it's used to mean to understand, but it's also 100 times more. It can mean to love and it can mean to hate at the same time. To quote the book, it means almost everything that we mean by religion, philosophy, and science, and it means as little to us as color does to a blind man. Unquote. After some shenanigans of Mike trying to adjust to Earth and gaining some water brothers, he is introduced to a popular new cultish church called the Fosterites, which resemble a parody of televangelist megachurches, which were already getting their start in the 50s. There's the usual televangelist sensationalism, dancing, chanting, speaking in tongues, prosperity gospel, but it looks more like a Vegas show. Slot machines, strippers, and an open bar are used to draw people in and convert the unfaithful. Advertisers sponsor individual hymns in the service. And for some reason, the mummified body of the church's founder, the so-called Archangel Foster, is kept in his chair on the stage. It looks like a really offensive parody, in that it comes across as completely tone-deaf and uninformed about how actual Christianity works. But Heinlein brilliantly turns this around in the next chapter, with a dramatic scene where he holds up a mirror to mainstream religion. If people play bingo for money in church, he says, why not slot machines? And even the practices that aren't Christian are known from other religions, while the Fosterites' actual teachings are far more benign than you get in the Sodoms and Gomorrahs of many sacred texts. And Mike loves it. While he disapproves of some of the Fosterites' practices, he adapts many of them to found his own church, the Church of All Worlds. Central to this church is the fact that Mike is only able to render the concept of God into Martian as one who groks, which then leads him to the religious mantra, "Thou art God." Members of the new church learn the Martian language, or you might say they grok it, and doing so gives them the Martians' psychic powers. Scientifically, this is pretty silly, of course, and it gets even weirder with the hints in story that there are genuine angels on Mike's side, but the book pulls it off well. It's a very interesting read overall. However, I want to offer a rare, special content warning for Stranger in a Strange Land. I feel that it should only be read by mature readers. Not so much for explicit content, there's some free love going on, but it's not nearly as bad as Heinlein's later works, but for philosophical and religious content that could be detrimental to less mature readers. And I apologize if you think this is editorializing too much, but there is some real basis to say this. After it was published, Heinlein had to build a fence around his house, in part to keep out fans who took Stranger in a Strange Land a little too seriously, and wanted to treat the Church of All Worlds as a real religion. And in fact, it did happen. Not long after the book was published, a man named Oberon Zell Ravenheart founded a neo-pagan church called the Church of All Worlds that was partly based on Stranger in a Strange Land. It was officially recognized as a church in 1968, and he still leads it today. I don't want to deter fans from reading this book, by no means, but you should come in prepared for what you're going to find. Okay, after all that, let's try politics again. A few years after Stranger in a Strange Land, Heinlein wrote The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. This book is Heinlein back in top form with hard sci-fi, describing the life of colonists on the moon in detail. The story goes that in 2075, the moon is a penal colony, with most of its 3 million inhabitants, called loonies, being the descendants of criminals shipped up from Earth. The loonies are trapped on the moon because they are unable to adapt to Earth's gravity, and are exploited by Earth to grow food at the cost of the moon's limited water supply. But while Earth legally controls the moon, the real power there is an advanced artificial intelligence, who as it happens is also named Mike, except this time it's short for Mycroft Holmes, the computer's official name being Holmes 4. Seeing environmental disaster looming on the horizon, Mike coordinates with Manny, one of his technicians, Manny's mentor, Professor De La Paz, and Wyo, a political agitator, to start a revolution and declare the moon an independent country. Despite strong opposition and a low chance of success, Mike's strategy for defeating Earth, throw rocks at them, works out well. This book probably describes Heinlein's radical libertarian politics most clearly. The moon is a frontier society modeled on the Old West, where individualists can live relatively unimpeded. The professor points out that the new nation is free to invent its own system of government, and suggests a number of wild ideas that are very slanted toward a weak, limited government. And of course, the book famously popularized the acronym TANSTAFL, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch, which is also central to Heinlein's views. Heinlein, of course, keeps up his usual standard of scientific rigor, for the time, this was before the Apollo missions, describing in detail how a lunar colony would work, living in underground cities, mining ice to grow grain, how life works in close quarters surrounded by vacuum and with limited resources, plus aspects of space warfare like mass drivers and astronavigation. And just as Starship Troopers has been the template for military sci-fi novels over the years, I can see the influence of The Moon is a Harsh Mistress in later works as well, most recently in Andy Weir's Artemis. But Heinlein goes beyond this and also explores the social aspects of such a society. Because the first generation of deportees were overwhelmingly male, the loonies practiced several subtly different forms of polygamy, specifically polyandry, and anyone who attacks a woman is more likely to be thrown out the airlock than arrested. Because many of the deportees were Russian dissidents, the loonies speak a Creole with Russian influence that doesn't use articles, a slight echo of what Anthony Burgess did in A Clockwork Orange a few years earlier. The loonies are also completely racially integrated. Manny's full name is Manuel Garcia O'Kelly Davis, suggesting an unusual mix of ethnicities. This is unremarkable today, but since Heinlein wrote the book in 1966, 1 year before interracial marriage was made legal throughout the United States, it was a big deal then, and it gets Manny in trouble during his diplomatic visit to Earth. It's the way Heinlein builds a whole new society in the story that really sells it. This book also shows how Heinlein grew more liberal with his depictions of sex over his career. Where in Stranger in a Strange Land it was described more euphemistically and happened mostly off-screen, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress contains frank discussions of the logistical challenges of a clumsy, high-gravity Earth immigrant sleeping with a native-born loony. And on that note, we segue into the last book on the list for this episode, Time Enough for Love. Hoo boy, this one gets pretty wild. I mean, seriously, Lazarus Long spends the last 100 pages trying to get in bed with his own mother, and I'm not even convinced that's the worst part. The actual descriptions are a lot more explicit, too. I did warn you there would be sex. The thing is, this is not a hippie story. Aside from his sexual mores, Lazarus is a classic rugged individualist. As in, he goes off in a literal covered wagon to settle a new planet 8 times. But like I said at the start, it's still very sexual revolution, which was kind of Heinlein's thing, especially in his later years. Lazarus Long, our protagonist, is immortal, or rather very long-lived, as a result of a genetic mutation. He was born as Woodrow Wilson Smith in 1912 as part of a eugenics project to extend human lifespans, which in the future benefits all humans. Thanks to futuristic medical technology, Lazarus's already long lifespan has been extended indefinitely, and he is now over 2,000 years old. At his age, he feels that he has seen and done it all, and that life is no longer worth living. But he is strong-armed into sticking around and recounting his memoirs to his distant descendant, Ira Weatherall. What follows are various tales of his past exploits, from his time as a 20th century Navy officer like Heinlein himself, to building one of his pioneer homesteads on a distant planet. Eventually, he regains his enthusiasm for life and settles down with a new polyamorous family, including 2 opposite-sex clones. Yes, he sleeps with them too. Before finally traveling back in time to meet his birth family on the eve of World War I. Some critics have claimed that Heinlein was merely trying to get his readers to question the conventional wisdom, rather than actually promoting any alternative lifestyles. He does seem to be doing that when he challenges the taboo of incest by saying that if the risks of pregnancy or even just genetic disease are eliminated, it shouldn't be a problem. On the other hand, he was a practicing nudist, and body taboos in general show up a lot in his work. That fence I mentioned earlier wasn't only to keep out Stranger in a Strange Land fans. So while Heinlein was in a happy monogamous marriage for almost his entire post-war career, he wasn't afraid of being at least a little unconventional in real life. It's also worth noting that Heinlein wrote 5 novels in his so-called late period in the 80s, 3 of which were sequels to Time Enough for Love, which sound even more radical based on the descriptions. Even so, it's hard to overstate Heinlein's contribution to the genre. He is credited with a large role in pushing sci-fi into mainstream publishing, with elevating the standard to more serious writing, and with setting standards higher regarding both scientific rigor and social commentary in particular. He certainly didn't do any of these things alone, but there's no doubt his reach was long. His influence appears in language, too. Heinlein coined the word Waldo for a remote-controlled or robotic arm. He also coined moonbat, grok, of course, and a term that we've been using in this series from the start, speculative fiction. Speculative fiction was a phrase he used for soft sci-fi, which he considered more space fantasy than true science fiction, although it now applies more broadly. And although he didn't coin it, Heinlein also popularized the phrase pay it forward in one of his juvenile novels, Between Planets, along with Space Marine and, of course, Tan Stoffel. Granted, he was still a product of his time. Cory Doctorow mentions Heinlein's dark side in his article on the cold equations, which I previously linked in episode 11. He points to several of Heinlein's novels that by today's standards are really racist, sexist, or just plain messed up. One of these, Sixth Column, was even one of the juveniles. But interestingly, Heinlein once wrote that Sixth Column was a reworking of someone else's unpublished story called All, and that he had to quote-unquote reslant it to remove racist aspects. If you've been following me so far, you can probably guess who wrote All. It was John W. Campbell. Like I said, Heinlein's work goes to some weird places. Even some of his early stories, like By His Bootstraps, go weird places. But there can be no doubt that he was a highly accomplished writer who could tell a good story and make you think, and many of his novels are still worthwhile reads today. This has been a reader's history of science fiction. This podcast is available a bunch of places that I don't have time to list right now, and you can also find me on my website, sciencemeetsfiction.com. My book recommendation for this episode is The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. Starship Troopers is a close second, probably the best military sci-fi novel I've read, but I'm picking The Moon is a Harsh Mistress as a wider-ranging and more representative example of Heinlein's later work. Next episode, we're moving on to the next Golden Age author on the list, Ray Bradbury. Thanks for listening.